It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little.
Socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings in Miles Davis music. An aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Hey there, happy listeners. Welcome to a fourth edition of the Acid Left podcast. This edition comes to you from the Adorno Studies Podcast and will be hosted by Stephen Grigsby, who'll be asking me questions about Theodore Adorno and contemporary culture. Stephen runs a Facebook group called Adorno Studies and will be making more podcasts in the future, so please sign up to that Facebook group and be sure to follow the SoundCloud simply called Adorno Studies Podcast.
Well, it's good morning here in the United States still, and I am speaking to Dr. Mike Watson, who is in Europe, and it's a later hour there. And I have invited him to be the first guest on what may be a series of podcasts for the Facebook webpage that I started some time ago, called Adorno Studies. Just a little background, there wasn't any grand plan when I started it. I just simply was tired of getting kicked off other group discussions, so I started my own so I couldn't get kicked off, and I was interested in Adorno. It's grown from several people to almost 5,000 people. But anyway, today we have Dr. Mike Watson as a guest, and he has written a very important book that I think significantly tries to deal with contemporary topics in a way that's intellectually very serious with respect to Adorno. So with that, please say hi, Dr. Watson, and if you could explain a little bit about who you are and your book, I'd like to give you that chance.
Hi there. Thank you for having me on. I think this is the first podcast you're doing. I've been a great fan of the Facebook page, or let's say I'm just kind of happy there is an Adorno Facebook page which is engaged with to some level of seriousness. I think we first met because I was posting on that Facebook page, and maybe I posted things relevant to my book and they were kind of controversial. And I think when you write a popular book about Adorno, you expect to kind of upset a few Adornian scholars. But anyway, that kind of proved to me that the book was, in some sense, a success, even I think before it was released, because it's basically a book out with 0 books, which attempts to look at Adorno through the prism of some very, on the surface, un-Adornian trends in new media, such as the internet meme, YouTube videos, etc. Basically millennial culture, or what we would have called millennial culture, and now we increasingly call Zoomer culture, the culture of people who are becoming adults, I'd say, who are increasingly kind of seen and heard on the internet. Young people, basically, people who are beginning their university degrees, etc. So my book, Can the Left Learn to Meme, is an attempt to consider their culture and to put it in a positive light, using Adorno's kind of unswerving positivity held out for the cultural object, in the sense that Adorno was, very negative, like I think young people are today. But within that negativity, he kind of still held out for some quasi-transcendental capacity of the art object. And it's that I'm seeing in online culture. And it's that probably you found controversial at some point. We had a bit of an argument on your Facebook page.
We did, and it was, I'm a particularly rude person when I argue with people. I just simply don't abide niceties, but it's partly out of a sense that if you have to conform yourself to a digestible manner and style of delivering a message, that ultimately sort of absorbs the message. But in any event, what I found very interesting about even what I was arguing against, and arguing against something is really, I think, a type of respect, was something that I thought was serious. And that is that on the one hand, as you've said, you have Adorno, who is sort of the master of negativity, yet within that negativity, there is some deep conviction that things ought to be different or better. So I'd like you to begin by explaining what you had just said earlier a little bit more, commenting on that, and that is something that you've dealt with, popular media culture in Adorno, which ostensibly would seem a poor fit. Why? Can you just develop that insight a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I suppose people, when they look at Adorno and try and apply Adorno to contemporary media culture, assume that his stance towards mass media, as laid out famously in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, co-written by Max Horkheimer, to assume that we need to be applying that kind of sensation that mass media, whilst kind of posing as a kind of tableau of free choices for the media consumer, is actually made on behalf of the kind of democratic capitalist system as a means of brainwashing. And that, contemporary meme culture, social media, can only be that kind of model, but shall we say on steroids, or kind of, times 10. My kind of feeling is that we can't simply apply Adorno's stance in the 1940s as applied to mass media products, TV, radio, magazines, etc., to today's culture, given that, for example, Adorno and Horkheimer were very clear that one of the main problems with mass media is that whilst there's a choice posed, one can go to the cinema and choose between 5 films. Those 5 films push a fairly homogenous message, which aims at kind of concretizing a story about capitalist society, which leads people to be good kind of subservient consumers. That being the case, we'd have to admit that actually, social media, meme culture, YouTube is a step on, in the sense that if the main complaint is a lack of choice, we now have much, much more choice. So, going on that as one example of how things have changed, we maybe need to, redress Adorno's thought, and indeed ask whether he might have seen some aspects of contemporary culture as even good.
Let me ask you to think about this. There seems to me there are 2 ways in which there is a complaint lodged by Adorno about mass culture. One is at the level of content, and that is that, as you I think just said, that you typically get in cinema allegories of values and ideas that are pertinent to the reproduction of capitalism. But he also at times talks about the form itself, is that the form is limited. And in the form, even when it has even a particularly radical message, the form undermines that message by simply treating it as a medium of the communication for a datum. Do you have any thoughts about the differences in form and content, which, I think your remark was, sort of mass media would be the cultural forms on steroids that he talked about in the 40s, 50s, and 30s. Isn't that even what you mean by on steroids, the level of form in the meme culture of today?
I suppose what you're saying is that something about the form of mass media negatively affected the content. The kind of mass production leads to a content that in itself is perhaps capitalist, for one. I can see that. I can see that same concern being applied to social media, for sure. But I think that Adorno, if you look at his kind of whole body of works, he's arguing that actually something about capitalism contains something that goes beyond capitalism, and something about our domination per se, which has run throughout history as a domination of man over nature, which becomes a domination of man over man inadvertently. Something about that also kind of gives an exemplar of how we might go beyond that. And I think that's actually essentially Marxist. When you see Marx talk about capitalism, he says that capitalism contains the seeds of something coming after it, that capitalism, okay, is bad, but this kind of mass production, industrial production, the way it brings people together in the workplace, building, big things, kind of suggests that if they were to organize in certain other ways, they might actually, conceive of a more reasonable kind of society using those same kind of tools of production for good ends. I think the same could be said of the media. And Adorno actually says in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the mass media, yes, it makes people stupid, but more intelligent at once. And it's this kind of, this thing of, it's mind-numbing, but also we can't deny that there's some level of education, kind of unprecedented level of education information coming through, both in the mass media and now in new media. And shouldn't we be kind of somehow excited about that?
Well, I am confident that I recall that point about the sort of the sheer mass by which information and ideas are disseminated in Marx contains the possibility of galvanizing a potential revolution, but I'm not sure that I see that particular optimism in Adorno. And what I found interesting about what you're trying to do is to deal with what I think is a chronic and perennial issue, and that is that does not a message that is promoted through snippets and sound bites and sort of like, I think, what you would call the meme, tend to dull reflection. But let me put it this way. So Adorno, and this is a prepared question I had, Adorno is, as we've talked about, is ostensibly the opposite of what one would expect to be harmonized with social media. With respect to film, which long preceded the YouTube culture that you deal with, he said each one left him dumber and worse. I don't see in any work of Adorno, but my reading is perhaps deficient, that kind of optimism that you described. Is there, and is Adorno wrong in saying that they make people dumber and worse?
The line I'm thinking about in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, he says the flood of precise information and brand new amusements make people smarter and more stupid at once. And I actually quoted it in my book. I mean, it's there, but it's very fleeting. It's not like he builds on that. But I really kind of think we can't ignore that smarter and more stupid is still somehow smarter. But addressing your point, would Adorno say that memes dull reflection? I mean, I think he certainly was saying that mass media dulls reflection. We can get rid of this caveat that it makes people also smarter, because this is, as I say, it's a fleeting statement in the dialectic of enlightenment. Okay, he says it dulls reflection. Would the meme dull reflection? Well, there is some talk in Minima Moralia about comics. I think basically comic strips, the kind you would find in newspapers, or newspapers used to have, maybe they still do, this kind of free comic supplement on Sundays. He's talking about what you might have in America used to call the funnies, I guess, or something. But he's kind of saying how these are some kind of abomination. You can see how he might have found memes to be over frivolous, and I suppose that looking at these kind of silly, very kind of, how can we say, very pithy, very, they have a very short kind of span of temporality memes. They're funny, they're silly, they're quick, and then they're just gone, and then you see another one, and you see another one. Okay, well, this seems perfect for keeping us stupid and keeping us compliant to the capitalist data system as it now is. So yeah, I can see all that is negative, but Adorno also says in aesthetic theory, I think it is, he touches upon the absolute commodity, and again, it's something fleeting, and something that's a kind of frustrating with Adorno is there are so many great one-liners that don't in themselves go anywhere, that you have to kind of piece them together with the rest of his work, and this is kind of almost methodical, and I think you would agree from the notes you sent me prior to this that something in the form of Adorno deliberately resists a kind of logic, because he himself is kind of pointing to the failings of rationality and how they contribute to the kind of heinous aspects of capitalism. But he has these kind of snippets, but he talks about the absolute commodity in one kind of passage in aesthetic theory. And what he basically says is that commodities, things you buy, I don't know, new mobile phones, trainers, running shoes, whatever, they kind of tell a lie. They kind of, there is their material form, but they point to something beyond their material form. They point to something they can give the human, a kind of the commodity fetish, as Marx called it. And he says that the artwork, goes one step further. That the pair of new running shoes says, "I'll make you more appealing. I'll make you more healthy, more attractive to the, to the opposite sex, as it would be traditionally, or to people who you want to find, who you want to appeal to." But he said that the artwork goes a step further, and it claims to be completely kind of beyond the system of commodification as such. An artwork, whether it be a painting or a classical piece of music, it kind of says that I'm beyond all of this. And that's what he calls the absolute commodity. And Adorno kind of believes that the artwork in this sense can lead us temporarily outside the false commodified system of existence. And it gives, in that sense, it gives us hope that if the artwork can fleetingly take us outside these false material conditions of capitalism, that it may kind of one day lead us to think of a better way of living, or give us fleeting kind of thoughts that resist commodification of capitalism. But crucially, the absolute commodity is a commodity, and it steals a trick of commodification and kind of amplifies it. So for Adorno, I don't think that there's something intrinsically terrible about commodified mass culture, because it actually gives us or hints at the tools that might lead us beyond those.
Well, there's no question that for Adorno, art has a special position. Yeah, even bad art is still that, by its aesthetic logic, a critique of empirical reality. But it seems to me that there are, and he himself is, although we're nothing obliges anyone, including us here or anybody in Adorno's studies, to, take Adorno at his word. I mean, I haven't found too many sources that are effectively critical of Adorno, but in principle, that can be the case. But he does distinguish between, different types of art. I spoke once before, there are several people, Beckett, Celan, Kafka, Proust, whom he refers to all the time as being exemplary instances in music. I suppose Arnold Schoenberg would be the case. That they are not, it's not just simply that it is an aesthetic work, that even within aesthetic works there is quite a range, and that there are people who do it better than others. So, for example, we have Beckett's trilogy, in which the economy of the novel is reduced to virtually the theme of narration going on despite its own impossibility. And it seems to me that that's critical to Adorno's basic position on art, and by that I mean that there are significant differences between art, and that the kind of pop art that you see in a meme, to which is attached a easily digestible quip, doesn't seem, and I'd like you to disagree with me if you do, to really have the same emancipatory potential as something like Beckett. On the other hand, there's only a handful of people that are going to read Beckett in that way anyway.
Well, that may be the case. I'm struggling to really think what Adorno would say about memes, and I think we have to really just deal with the fact that he's not going to say anything about memes because he's not around, and then we have to kind of take the tools that he gave us and use them in a way that seems fitting and useful to our own times. Having said that, I mean, if you look at some of the examples when he talks about the kind of art that he thinks can lead to, moments of truth, kind of quasi-transcendentalism that again leads us beyond the false conditions of a capitalist society. I mean, Kafka is, it's certainly a metamorphosis. The premise is kind of very, very quick, very. It depends on a certain acquiescence on the part of the reader, which to me is not entirely intellectual, or not in the sense of some other references that Adorno makes. It's not. Is it really high art? I mean, Edgar Allan Poe as well. I mean, some of his stories are very, very short. I mean, they're almost the literary equivalent, if not of memes, then maybe of comic books. Comic strips. So I don't know really what Adorno would make of memes, except to say that, what he's really banking on is that certain types of art will disrupt your thinking, will break us out of a complacency which is fostered by capitalism. And then I think that there's something in internet culture, because it's so jarring and so discontinuous, and it's so much a movement of images we don't really have much control over, even if we're deliberately clicking different links, that there is an element that one is routinely shocked and disrupted, and this could maybe lead to what Adorno called the shudder, which is a term that comes in from the dialectic of enlightenment and keeps reappearing through to his last unfinished work, Aesthetic Theory, although it's poorly translated in the English in both versions of dialectic of enlightenment. So you don't see the word at all, shudder, but it was there as a German shower, later reappears, I think, as schauder, which is synonymous in German in aesthetic theory. But it's this term that keeps reappearing, and basically what it is it's a moment of shock, either in the face of nature, untamed by man, or of the artwork. And what that does is it temporarily, it takes you out of, or takes one out of one's false, how do you say, the false distinction between oneself as the subject and the rest of the world of nature as the object. This false distinction for Adorno being the kind of root of every kind of mistake humans make. This shock, because in being shocked you're not able to apply your normal kind of resources of thinking. This shock suddenly kind of brings humans to awareness of their linkedness, their oneness with nature, with the external object. I don't see any reason why that shock can't occur through the internet. So I'd maybe put that back to you. I mean, do you really think that it's impossible to have that kind of experience via internet culture?
I don't think the internet as a pure medium necessarily is fated to be promote a culture that's consistent with the aims of capitalist ideology. On the other hand, I think what I have seen is that it has accelerated the sort of the intellectual laziness and thoughtlessness, because unlike before, one never had to write a book to have an opinion disseminated to millions of people immediately through Facebook or the other media. But I think it's accelerated that trend, and the meme, I think, is particularly implicated in this because it suggests that complex issues, and if Adorno is anything, he's somebody who appreciated complexity, are reduced to simple, straightforward statements that are seemingly the essence of identity thinking. For example, there's a big difference between the kind of aphorism or the aphoristic statement you find in a meme versus Adorno's own ability to be pithy. When he, for example, in Minima Moralia, he has the statement that true thoughts alone are those that do not understand themselves. Now, that is potentially the subject of a meme, but I don't see that any graphic image or simple picture could easily correspond with something like that. It would be hard to imagine a statement like that expressing the kind of logical tension that it expresses be suitable for dissemination in a meme. Do you think so?
Well, I mean, you say yourself, it's almost meme-like. And I agree that Adorno's aphorisms are almost meme-like, and in effect have become memes if we go to the kind of wider meaning of meme, which was this term devised by I forget his name. I shouldn't. Stephen Dawkins, Richard Dawkins. Yeah, so the meme was devised by Richard Dawkins in the 70s, and he came up with the word. It comes from a Greek word, but he actually came up with the word in his English form to rhyme with gene. So the meme is like the kind of language or cultural equivalent of the human gene, as in DNA sequence. So a meme basically is a cultural unit that gets repeated and appropriated, like a kind of expression or a tune that you hum, and that's become now the internet meme, which we generally use to refer to an image with text that goes viral, but it can also be a video. But a lot of Adorno's sayings have become mean. A lot of the things he said in text have become memes that are kind of readily used in conversation without people really knowing what they mean. Like it's impossible to make art after Auschwitz being one. Now, is that kind of a meme? And does its removal from the wider text it was part of, and actually it appeared more or less the same sentence in a couple of different Adorno essays, but does its removal from its wider context make it less useful, or does its kind of its use in pub conversations throughout the Western world, among semi-intellectuals to intellectuals? I mean, now I sound a snob, but I don't mean it in that way. But does it taken out of context make it useless? It actually probably not. Probably it makes it, if anything, more useful because it can fit into multiple different conversations, and almost like a Zen koan. So I don't know. I think go on.
Also, not to mention the poetry after Auschwitz was also repudiated when he read the poems of Paul Celan, because he found a type of lyric poetry that didn't seem barbaric after Auschwitz, and I think his remark was something along the lines of the victims have a right to wail and scream.
Yeah, I mean, given his own contradiction, I mean, even within one essay or paragraph, Adorno contradicts himself. Is it a bad use of Adorno to take bits of his text out of context? I don't think so. Not if it's useful. But yeah, he certainly did contradict the impossibility of making art after Auschwitz in the essay on commitment. Is that where he mentions Celan?
I think that's somewhere at the end of in some of the addenda at the end of aesthetic theory. I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, but he just to go back to memes. I mean, memes often employ deliberate obfuscation of grammar, which I think is interesting. Visually, they employ glitches and abstraction, and obviously Adorno was very pro abstraction, or we haven't got to that, but Adorno believed that we would break through false conditions of thought, or false conditions of thought and action arising from those false conditions, not through reproducing them, as in making a painting depicting the suffering of Auschwitz, for example, or writing about it. He actually said, we need to come up with a form of art that is abstract and therefore does not repeat our kind of fundamental mistake, which is to categorize things falsely, what you call identity thinking, to identify things, objects that we can't really ever know accurately. So Adorno's kind of response to this false way of identity thinking is to propose an abstraction, and as we get lost in that abstraction, we break through this tendency to try and subsume nature, to subsume objects under false kind of predicates of thought. That kind of abstraction does appear in memes through the glitch. So, there's some kind of formal closeness to Adorno in memes. I think the thing that people find difficult, scholars of Adorno find difficult, I think it's just the quickness of the meme. That we tend to look at memes for a few seconds and then move on for a couple of seconds maybe. This doesn't really tally with his preference for classical music, particularly Mahler and Schönberg, Beethoven. You don't see it so much in Kafka and his literary references because they are quite quick, I think, in the way they work. But, I think Adorno was primarily a scholar of music. He was also a composer, I think. And this sensation you get when you read him talking about Mahler and Schönberg is one of being kind of absorbed in these artworks of duration. Music has a duration, and I think actually he's right. The music is the form of art that is best at getting one kind of lost. You get lost, and therefore you forget the false break between the human subject and a natural object. And it's hard to see, I think, how one can be lost in a meme the same way one could be lost in a piece of classical music. And I can quite agree with that, except that one rarely ever consumes only one meme. That you tend to see memes as a continuum of different memes and other kind of media objects on the internet. And so could it not be that one can become lost in the internet as a kind of flow of subsequent images? That's where I would think that it maybe resembles, the internet kind of resembles an abstract piece of music favored by Adorno, like Schönberg's Erwartung. I'm not sure if I said that right. Anyway, like Schönberg's pieces, it resembles it as a kind of flux of abstract image and noise rather than as isolated memes.
Well, there is no question that music, has a greater immediate relationship to temporality than for instance, a piece of literature whose words can be looked at, over and back. When you're listening to the performance of a piece, there is a greater need to exercise one's memory and to compare the way in which contrasting themes, sounds, or units of musical statement interact with one another. I think that's unique to music. But for example, I would suggest that even though Poe, I think he does mention Poe a few times, but he certainly mentions Kafka. If you take even Kafka's short work like the Metamorphosis, it's not the duration that I think alone that contributes to the complexity. It's the sort of use of a surreal color, the fact of a man turning into a beetle in a room in which everything else, however, appears to be going on utterly, completely normally. It's not really surrealism, but it sort of is really sort of a surreal use of. I think it's at the convergence of what realism and surrealism is, and I say that because Adorno mentions at another time that Georg Lukács, after he was arrested, suddenly made the statement that he now believed Kafka was in fact a realist, and the point is that, of course, reality, also has a surreal dimension to it. But there's one thing that you said that I wanted to focus on, because this had to do with one of the prepared notes, that you talked about how the depiction of images of Auschwitz would undermine the type of attitude that would be appropriate to breaking away from the kind of thinking that led to it. And you talked about the shudder. And I think I want to bring this because this was a point that I was arguing with you on Facebook, that you thought that Stranger Things was a cultural artifact that could give a legitimate representation of the shudder. But isn't the relationship of Stranger Things to the shudder sort of an illustration of the sort that would be disqualified as our depictions of Auschwitz? Could you talk about that?
Okay, well, in the book Can the Left Learn to Meme, I talk about Stranger Things, particularly about one scene. Actually, there are a number of different ways I use Stranger Things, but there's one scene kind of relevant. By the
way, I hadn't watched it until you mentioned it, and I was not going to watch it, but I watched the whole thing all the way through, and I enjoyed it.
Okay, great. I think it's a good series. And it somehow fitted in with what I was trying to get across in the book. basically there's a part where the young central character starts scribbling furiously, and he scribbles all these kind of well, it's almost like a Pollock-esque kind of pen scribble, and at some point his mother and her partner look at these scribbles, and they manage to piece together a map, and the map somehow is kind of crucial in them for some period overcoming the kind of dark forces underground, the Demogorgon, etc. So it just kind of demonstrated the way that abstraction can yield truths. And I think it was that simple what I was dealing with. But then also that what in the Stranger Things, the main characters are fighting in the town of Hawkins is a kind of a monster that's been somehow created by the military-industrial complex and lives underneath their town. So it all seemed perfect, because what Adorno seems to be saying is that abstraction, because it's unintelligible, can point to the falseness of the military-industrial complex itself as a kind of reflection of our basically flawed thinking, which again, arises from our tendency to try and separate ourselves as humans from nature, as ourselves as a subject from the natural object, and to then go around trying to control the natural object to such an extent that we end up inadvertently controlling ourselves. So we start kind of trying to measure and control everything, and we finish by measuring and controlling ourselves as kind of monetary units. We all have a kind of wage value, and this is kind of our intention on dominating nature, turning in on ourselves. And Adorno says, well, we can't disrupt that by depicting it, because you're only really repeating the original problem. That's why one can't simply draw or paint Auschwitz, because apart from that, there's a potential to elicit enjoyment for some people from images of suffering in warfare or other images of suffering, that you're basically just repeating by drawing suffering, you're repeating the mistake of categorizing falsely experience. So Adorno says that it's only through abstraction that we can get to this, and the abstraction then would lead you to a realization. Well, what basically happens is that one looks at abstract artwork, or more for Adorno, listens to abstract music, or listens to music generally, because music is the most abstract art form, and one becomes lost. And in the being lost, you're no longer differentiating, saying that I am the human subject, that in front of me is a tree or an animal that needs somehow acting upon to make it useful for me as a human, needs somehow dominating. You're no longer making those distinctions. You're no longer even thinking. We've all had that experience of being lost listening to music, and you're no longer able to make the normal kind of rudimentary false distinctions that we make every day. But for Adorno, it's not that point that's crucial, although that is important, but it's at some point one is rudely awakened from that moment in which you're lost in contemplation of music. And it's that's really the shudder. And you're suddenly in that moment returned into yourself, and you realize then the false distinctions. And you realize, the real nature of society. And I think in Stranger Things, when, and now all the names of the characters elude me, the young guy who is in contact somehow kind of psychically with the evil forces underground,
Will,
in
right?
Hawkins, when he's like scribbling frantically, everyone just kind of thinks he's being nuts again, because they just think that he has some mental disorder. And it's kind of unclear, which I find really interesting, and I mentioned in the book, whether he has a mental disorder and he's also attuned to the kind of dark forces underground. One doesn't necessarily preclude the other. But they think he's just scribbling because he's not sane perhaps. And then these scribbles turn out to lead them to a realization of the false conditions of capitalism as such. It's not said that there, but again, the military-industrial complex. So I use that analogy, and I guess what you're saying is it's an analogy. So as such, I'm pointing myself to a depiction which is figurative, a film, and that in itself isn't. It's not abstract reality. I'm not presenting an abstraction. I'm presenting an allegory of an abstraction. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I was suggesting is that in his essay Commitment, he talks about, Sartre and Sartre's notion that, literature has to take a position, become partisan, and argue for the right thing. And what Adorno says is that any clear representation of an object, and in literature would be any communication of a datum, that these are instances of identity thinking that share with a very conservative position with respect to capitalism, a sort of squeamishness, a dislike of what's not, immediately digestible, what is not immediately intelligible. In other words, it's a cultural conservatism with respect to sort of the shock of the avant-garde of novel types of expression. And so what I was suggesting, and I think this is what our discussion was about on Facebook, is that something like Stranger Things, well, it certainly can illustrate an instance of the shudder. It also tends to denature the shudder by reducing it to any sort of phenomena that's like just a burst of lightning, a momentary loss of orientation. That's what I was suggesting was the case with something like Stranger Things.
Okay, but your premise was not then that because it's allegorical, the presentation of it as an example of shudder is kind of inadequate. It's not the shudder in itself.
Yes,
it's a depiction of the shudder. I mean, I can understand that, but I think Adorno himself constantly uses allegory to explain his point, and I think for Adorno, there's this contradiction that we're fundamentally incorrect in our way of thinking, but at the same time, that what he calls identity thinking, it's not like a mistaken element of thought; it's thought itself. That thought always proceeds through identification. So there's his expression, and I think it's in Negative Dialectics, where Adorno says that the opposite of identity thinking, what would be non-identity thinking, is akin to thinking the dark side of the moon. And by that, I think he means that it's impossible. One cannot think beyond identity thinking. That's the aspiration. That would be the ideal, but it's not. It's not going to happen. It's a kind of. I think Adorno calls philosophy the melancholy science. Is it not that a subtitle of Minima Moralia?
No, that's A Damaged Life. Melancholy Science is Rosa Gilliam's.
Is it a book about Adorno?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then so Minima Moralia was subtitled A Damaged Life.
Reflections on a Damaged Life, I think.
Reflections on a Damaged Life. But in both cases, he's pointing towards kind of fundamental negativity that, Adorno, I think at base, he refused to see a way out of, humanity's problems or central problem. Because I think a way out for him was too dangerous, in that you would then kind of create another potential for totalitarianism, and he struggles with this a lot.
I think he believes that you can't think your way out of it. I mean, he has a line that's translated various ways. I think the best one is, "You can't live rightly in the wrong life," meaning that there are just certain limits to simply an epistemological way out of the problem, that that there is a fraternal sense of agreement with Marx's 11th thesis that, it's the world that has to be reconciled. In other words, you're right. Thought cannot happen without being identity thought. That's what the nature of thought is. But that's a limitation on thinking, and that there has to be some sort of praxis. And he just tends to be, I think, rightly pessimistic about the possibilities of the kind of fundamental change to the world in the absence of any viable communist party, in the absence of the forces that would not in the absence, but given the formidable power of the forces that would resist it, that fundamental change in material reality is just simply not likely.
Yeah, so I think that one can't think beyond examples.
Except I would say this, and this is, I think, was the point of our discussion, is that if you're writing a book and your book is an attempt to illustrate and explain, well, I mean, there's a certain type of language that is appropriate for that. It's the same kind of language Adorno himself used in his lectures, which don't have the difficulty of, for example, his work in aesthetic theory. But I think and it's not 100% clear to me, or I don't think it was 100% clear to Adorno, that art is a type of thinking. In his last series, his last lectures on aesthetics, he distinguishes philosophy as operating with concepts and the copula, with aesthetic thinking, which operates with mimesis rather than the copula. So in terms of thinking, there are two different ways. It's not clear to me precisely, what one is supposed to do with art, other than it becomes sort of a intellectual material model for an emancipated world.
Yeah, I think Adorno almost makes philosophy redundant. Obviously, he believed in philosophy, but you really get this impression of somebody kind of pointing to the pointlessness of their own exploits, which is why I think he's so important to today and to millennials. And I was actually teaching younger millennials, pushing on to Zoomers for 3 years in Rome, in Italy, in 2 American universities there. And I really saw, one thing is that Generation Xers, who most of my superiors were, were very negative about millennials and really, about, I suppose, millennials not being rebellious enough. And it was kind of weird because you have this kind of, I'm a Generation Xer, but a very young one pushing on towards millennial. But you have this kind of thing of university professors getting upset because their students won't rebel enough. So it's almost like, God damn it, you're supposed to be rebelling, which is kind of, kind of a strange thing to watch. And I felt very much in between these generations because I was about 18 years younger than my departmental superiors and about 18 years older than my younger students. But what I really saw is, a sense of futility amongst these students. They weren't maybe taking on board basic leftist messages that you are required to teach them and that you doubtless want to teach them if you're in the humanities department, and I was in the communications department. So I was dealing with Benjamin, Adorno, Marx, Baudrillard, etc. And what I really saw is that they really sensed that this stuff had all been done before. They certainly understood basic Marxist formulations, even when most of my students were, because it was a fee-paying university in Italy, which is quite unusual, or the state universities are virtually free there. The students tended to be very rich, but they could still regurgitate a basic Marxist formulation But I think that their kind of thinking was, isn't all of this part of what got us here today, which is what the left doesn't really want to confront, is that surely all leftist efforts up to now must be part of the kind of whole, part of the societal whole that got us where we are today. They didn't stop us getting where we are today. I don't think my students were on many levels very intellectual. They didn't want to go into intellectualism or academia, but they still, had, I think, this kind of basic kind of thought pattern going on. But I saw them still doing stuff, younger people are still constantly putting stuff out there. They're making memes, they're making videos, they're taking selfies. It might all seem kind of quite banal to many of their elders, but it fits very much in with Adorno's kind of injunction to keep making art. And we talked about how he actually turned against his own kind of dictum, one cannot make art or poetry after Auschwitz, because the conditions basically didn't exist. The point is, there cannot be anything one could call art in a society that would be responsible for the death camps. But then he says in Commitment, the essay where he talks about Jean-Paul Sartre, you were talking about earlier, he says later on that one must continue to make art anyway so that we don't surrender to cynicism. And I think that's where he's very useful to millennials, and that's where I say in the book that millennials are, in one respect, Adornian, in that they really do see a hopelessness that all kind of prior efforts to get beyond a completely commodified society haven't worked, and yet we can keep producing stuff. And somehow by keeping putting that stuff out there, something might click and move us onwards. And this, to me, is exactly Adorno's kind of legacy and thought.
Yeah, but it seems to me there's a big difference between the statement "make art" and the statement "make art, but don't repeat the problems of committed literature that Sartre did." Think along the lines of somebody like Beckett, and he has a long essay on Beckett's Endgame, in which is basically two people living after the happening of some implied catastrophe, and then that forms the background and the context of the quality of the statements they exchange, which are for the most part rather banal. He doesn't say produce a bunch of enthusiastic, colorful, politically robust statements in art. In fact, it's just the opposite.
Well, yeah, he's wary of directly political imagery, and actually, I would say that's a problem with the kind of political output of younger millennial and Zoomer meme producers. That you've probably seen. There was the kind of rise of the alt-right online, and their memes were very kind of in your face, and they employed imagery that I actually thought was illegal in the public realm, and then it started to surface, and it wasn't treated as illegal, but using swastikas and other far-right imagery perhaps is illegal in some countries, and by that I mean obviously Nazi swastikas. But then this was being responded to by the left wing by using hammers and sickles and images of Stalin, and I've often said that this, is basically kind of fighting fire with fire, just such that you end up with just a huge fire everywhere. I think abstract imagery is still the way forward, but I take the sum of all memes to be an abstraction, and that way you can maybe shake people out of their false way of thinking. I actually think individual left-wing memes, when they have very pointed, direct messages, are not very helpful at all. And I think that's probably quite unpopular when I've said it. but I still take that to be true. And in that sense, I agree with you that there isn't probably much value in the individual memes put out there, but the sum whole is disorientating. And even the individual units of the sum whole, by putting out these individual units, maybe something will give. Maybe the vast majority of an individual's meme input, kids that make memes, is only really repeating fundamental problems in human thought and behavior. But it doesn't, the fact that they're repeating, making, produce a possibility that they might make something that advances them or us.
Well, I think it was Benjamin that once conceived of the notion of an entirely objective book, and he said that it would be filled purely with other works quotes, and perhaps that would supply a model for the kind of meta view of the entire meme culture that you're mentioning here.
Sorry, I kind of missed what Benjamin said. Sorry, I couldn't answer that properly.
He referred to the notion of an objective book, and his concept of an objective book would be one that was entirely composed of quotes. And when you mentioned the notion that as a whole, the way that the different memes are interacting with one another, almost could be structured like a piece of music with thematic reiterations and contrast. But in any event, I think that what you said about that, if you look at sort of memes from a meta perspective, then you have the makings of the kind of abstraction and complexity that I think Adorno thought characterized authentic works of art.
For sure, yeah, that's definitely So I got some sound coming back there again. For sure, I mean, that's definitely my stance. I don't know how much it's being taken up by people. I think the thing is, by all means, make your memes however you want to make them. Make your YouTube videos, put out text onto the internet. But what you're putting out in itself is kind of superfluous. It's only as part of a much bigger abstract whole that it might be useful. And in that sense, I wonder if it might just be better if people try to make abstract memes. And I'm thinking now of my next book, next theoretical book, which will be more on Benjamin. But there I suggest that we may need to kind of reclaim the meme or reclaim the internet, in that the internet gives us a huge potential, but we're very much being led into the speed of capitalism, or led to emulate the speed of capitalism in production and reception of kind of creative objects that go on the internet. By that I mean the data economy demands kind of a high speed of turnover on the internet. It needs people to keep clicking, and somehow that leads us in our production to make things quickly, put them out there quickly, and expect people to receive them quickly. So there's no time for real reflection. And I'm just wondering whether we need to step back from that, use the internet because it's a great tool, but produce something more meditative that I would call a slow memes. And I would like to see people engage with that. And I wonder what an abstract meme would be. And it's something I've been kind of toying with. I know someone I work with a lot, a poet and artist Adam Ray Adkins, has been kind of looking into this. But I'd like other people maybe to explore it. But I don't know if this will ever catch on, because I think that, that somehow there's an appeal for young people getting into Marx. There is a huge appeal in Soviet imagery and these kind of things. I think if you're 18 or whatever, 16, and these people, really getting into this very young, that the notion of a violent revolution really appeals. And then someone like me saying, no, take a more Adornian approach, embrace abstraction, is written off as, bourgeois, Generation Xer, boomer even.
Well, I'm also a Generation Xer, and I find the whole millennial culture to be. I think I understand it. I was young, but there's a certain gravity to it that seems to distinguish the way I dealt with intellectual artifacts and the way they do, and they seem to have this sense that, since they have come several generations after Derrida and Foucault and the challenges of Le Grand Récit of Lyotard and postmodernism, they sort of begin with the notion that as long as it seems left and it has some sort of correspondence to the sort of the sexual and racial identity politics, that seems sufficient. And I don't see that kind of wrestling with tension and complexity.
Well, there's that element, but then there's a whole kind of tanky or Soviet element, which kind of gets routinely in arguments with what you're speaking about, the more identitarian strain of politics. But what I'm finding is that overall it's quite nihilistic. Again, that they don't seem to see solutions here, and I think that the kind of Soviet aspect is more a kind of throw your toys out of the pram because nothing's going to work. So it's more a will to destruction, not dissimilar to the alt-right. And Adorno would really despair of all this, and I think there were parallels going on in his time in terms of emerging left movements, the student movement in his own university that he wouldn't support in 1969. And that's a tough one. I mean, I suppose initiatives like the Adorno Facebook page, me trying to get people to think about Adorno through memes, are aimed at getting people to slow down and not just hurtle into left versus right kind of pitched battle, which will end up just with a lot of leftists in prison or worse. So there is there's some positivity. Maybe through online media we can get people to slow down and think about Adorno and maybe other ways of approaching politics.
Well, Dr. Mike Watson, it's been just over an hour. I appreciate very much that we finally got around to having a discussion, and look forward to perhaps something again in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, sure. Thank you for having me. That was very, very fruitful.